Welcome to the book of Deuteronomy, the last book, the final book in the Torah. And by the time we arrive at Deuteronomy, Israel has been delivered out of Egypt, and God brought them to the base of Mount Sinai, where they're going to spend a full year, and they're going to receive God's Torah. They're going to welcome God in the middle of their camp to dwell with them in the tabernacle, and they're going to enter into a covenant with their God. And then after that year, Yahweh's going to say, all right, go get them. Take what is yours. Enter the promised land. And they start marching then to the promised land, and they look over the edge and they're like, yeah, no, those guys are pretty big. I don't think I want to. God responds mercifully, really, by sentencing that first generation to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And after those 40 years, we arrive at the book of Deuteronomy, and now we are addressing the second generation. So it would have been those little tiny kiddos that God brought out of Egypt with their parents. And Moses is going to address the second generation with his locker room speech. Do you know what I mean by a locker room speech? You know, it's like a sports team, and the coach is going to gather all the players together, and he's going to say, all right, guys, there's a pretty good team out there on the field, but, you know, we've been preparing for this all season. You just got to go out there and execute, and we're going to come away with a victory. Deuteronomy is kind of like that, although with a little bit less laud, a little bit more grace. But let's take a look at how Deuteronomy is a speech of Moses. Okay, locker room speech. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel. And where did he speak? In the Jordan, in the wilderness, just on the other side of the Jordan River before they cross and enter the land. And this speech is going to have two purposes. And really, you can't get a better description of the first purpose than in Deuteronomy 4, verse 1, where it says, "And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and rules that I am teaching you, and do them, so that you may live and go in and take possession of the land." The first purpose of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses' speeches, is to urge that second generation to covenant faithfulness. And then the second purpose is found in verse 5 here of Deuteronomy 1, where it says, "Beyond the Jordan, the land of Moab, Moses, what did he do with his speeches? He undertook to explain this law." So in some sense, the book of Deuteronomy is going to be a commentary on the Torah, which preceded it, which came before it. And now I want to take a look at the structure of Deuteronomy. And it's actually a little bit complicated. There are three structures in Deuteronomy, and they kind of overlap on top of one another. It's a little bit odd. So the first structure is a series of speeches, right? It's a collection of speeches. The book of Deuteronomy isn't simply one speech, the transcript of that speech from the beginning all the way to the end. It's not that. It's a series of speeches. And the first one is going to start, of course, here in chapter 1. We saw that there in verse 5. And the second speech is going to actually start here in chapter 5. Let me see if I can draw a pulpit. I don't think Moses used a pulpit probably, but I think it helps visually if we can kind of get a little pulpit there. There's a little ugly pulpit, and there's going to be a third sermon of Moses, and that's going to start down here in chapter 29. So here we are, and a pulpit, why not? Let's see, how did I do this? Something like that. There's our pulpit. So the book of Deuteronomy is going to be composed of three sermons of Moses and then two poems. And the poems are going to be located here in chapter 32, a poem of warning, and then chapter 33, a poem of blessing. But Deuteronomy has been arranged so carefully and in such an orderly fashion. I want to show you that in a little handout. So check this out. Here's the structure. The book of Deuteronomy, the first of the three structures, is a set of sermons. And you'll notice how each of these sermons here in blue, these speeches, are going to have narrative introductions and narrative conclusions. So it's going to be narrative, speech, narrative, narrative, speech, narrative. And the center block actually doesn't have narratives around them. This is arguably the most important section of Deuteronomy, so put that away somewhere. And then, of course, there are the songs here at the end, each surrounded by narratives. And I want to show you here with this final example what I mean by these narrative brackets. So let's take a look here at Deuteronomy 33. Get an example of what I'm talking about. So here's the blessing. I want to zoom out a bit. And let's look at the narrative introduction. Moses' death. It's foretold. Go up on this mountain and die on the mountain. Okay, now we're going to have the song. Da, 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 da. And then afterwards, we're going to have a narrative kind of conclusion. And it says that Moses went up and he died on the mountain. Now, see how that kind of works where there's two brackets surrounding the center speech or the center poem? So let's take a look now at our third, our second structure. I said that there were three. Our second structure is actually a covenant treaty structure. So in the 1950s, a Hebrew scholar by the name of George Mendenhall, I should probably get his name right, George Mendenhall, in the 1950s, he discovered structural similarities between the book of Deuteronomy and ancient Hittite suzerain vassal treaties. Now that's like four mouthfuls right there. So what do I mean by that? An ancient Hittite suzerain vassal treaty were these formal documents, kind of like international policy documents between a big king and a little king. So the big king is called a suzerain and the little king is called a vassal. And usually a suzerain would have a big empire, and within that empire would be a lot of little kingdoms, and a Hittite treaty would be between that suzerain and one of his vassal kings. And it would be a document that described the nature of their relationship. And these treaties had predictable forms. They had the same patterns. Archaeologists have found about like 50 or so of these ancient treaties, and they all follow a pretty similar pattern. They're going to have all of these component parts in roughly the same order. And let's take a look at each of them. So these treaties are going to begin with a preamble, which is going to identify the author of the treaty, in other words, the suzerain. I am the suzerain. And then it's going to have a historical prologue, which is going to describe the relationship between the suzerain and the vassal. These are all the things I've done for you in the past. And then next is going to come the Stipulations Section, which are all of the things that the vassal must do for the suzerain. And this section, the Stipulation Section, is going to be divided between general stipulations, which are just kind of general calls to loyalty. You must be loyal to me, your suzerain. And then the specific stipulation, which are all the different things you must do. You've got to do this and this and this and this. It's very specific. And then the latter half of these ancient treaties are going to start with document clauses. And a document clause is going to have specific arrangements for where this treaty, let's say that this piece of paper is the treaty, here it is right here, the document clause is going to describe where should this physical thing be located. You got to put it in this specific house, the temple of your God. And it's also going to describe instructions for the periodic reading and rereading of this document. Every autumn at the autumn feast, you must read this document to all of the people, whatever. And then it's going to have a section of blessings and curses. These are the things which will happen to you if you obey these stipulations. These things will happen to you if you disobey them. And then finally, a list of witnesses, which in these ancient Hittite documents would typically be a long list of all these different gods which were witnessing the making of this treaty and who would then enact all of these blessings and cursings on the vassal. So the monotheistic version of this treaty, the suzerain vassal treaty, Deuteronomy is going to follow. And we're going to take a look at, as we go through this book, where each of these things kind of show up. But I do want to show a quick PDF overview of that first. So take a look here. We looked at the first structure, sermons. The second structure is a covenant renewal document. And here are the Hittite treaties and all of the component parts. And then here is the book of Deuteronomy. And you'll see that Deuteronomy has a preamble. It's got a historical prologue. It has both general and specific stipulations, document clause, blessings, cursings, and witnesses. However, there are a few discrepancies. This section here in chapter 4 doesn't fit the pattern. Neither does this section here, nor this portion of chapter 26. So there are parts that don't fit, exceptions to the rule. So what kind of explains both the similarities to this ancient form, but then also the differences? And I guess just initially, let me explain some of those differences. You remember how I noticed, or how I shared with you, that there are some narrative portions of Deuteronomy? There would never be narrative portions in ancient Hittite treaties. That wouldn't show up. Neither would like poetry be a part of these ancient treaties. That wouldn't be there. Also, the book of Deuteronomy is far too long to be an ancient Hittite suzerain vassal treaty. Those were always much shorter. However, the similarities between Deuteronomy and these treaties are definitely apparent. So something's going on, and what is it? So while Deuteronomy is itself not a Hittite suzerain vassal treaty, it is not a treaty, but it is patterned after one. I'm going to spell patterned. Patterned. So the book of Deuteronomy is patterned after a Hittite treaty. Now, why is it? Well, it has to do with the historical moment and the significance of the historical moment of the book of Deuteronomy and the message that Moses is preaching to this second generation. The second generation is about to set off on an impossible task. They're about to enter a battle that they simply cannot win. And therefore, at this moment, it is crucial that they renew the covenant. This is a covenant-making document, that they renew the document with their God, because success in the promised land is not going to depend upon their military might, because we know they don't have it. But it will depend on their wholehearted commitment and loyalty to their God, who will grant victory for them in the promised land. So I think that's probably why Deuteronomy is patterned after this covenant loyalty document. Now, I mentioned that there were three overlapping structures in the book of Deuteronomy. The first one are a collection of sermons. The second one is this suzerain vassal treaty. And the third one is a chiastic structure. So a chiasm is when the outside matches and then inside section matches, and then sometimes there's a center section as well. So the outside section, chapters 1 to 3 and 4, is a look backwards into history. And then this section, 31 to 34, is a look ahead into the future. You come in one section, and we have in chapter 5 the initial covenant stated. This is the covenant at Sinai, where the 10 Commandments are going to be listed. And then in this section, 27 to 28 and 29 to 30, we have the covenant restated. Covenant restated, and then in the center is a long section of laws. In this case, it's specific stipulations, 12 to 26. The center section is a section of laws. And we, in our following lectures, are going to take a look at each of these pieces and how they contribute to Moses' purpose to urge the second generation to covenant faithfulness in the land.